In 1963, Pontiac engineers built an engine so powerful that General Motors executives panicked. They didn't celebrate it. They didn't market it. They buried it. The Pontiac 421 Superduty was producing numbers that made the corporate suits nervous, numbers that threatened to expose just how fast American cars could really go. And so one of the most dominant racing engines ever created was quietly suppressed, hidden from the public, and nearly erased from history. This is the story of the 421 Superduty and the corporate politics that killed it. Along the way, we'll encounter drag strip dominance, NASCAR victories, backroom deals, and an engine that scared its own creators. So let us begin. But first, how did Pontiac, of all companies, end up building something this insane? Now, to understand the 421 Superduty, you need to understand what Pontiac was in the 1950s. And honestly, it wasn't much. Pontiac was the brand your dentist drove. It was the sensible choice, the middle-of-the-road option for middle-of-the-road people. General Motors had a hierarchy, Chevrolet at the bottom, then Pontiac, then Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac at the top. Pontiac's job was to be slightly nicer than a Chevy, but not as fancy as an Olds. Safe, boring, forgettable. But here's the thing. By the late 1950s, Pontiac was dying. Sales were dropping. The brand had no identity, no excitement, nothing to make anyone care. And that's when everything changed. In 1956, a man named Bunkie Knudsen took over as general manager. He was 43 years old, ambitious as hell, and he had one simple idea: make Pontiac exciting again. Knudsen understood something that the bean counters didn't. Racing sells cars. If you win on Sunday, you sell on Monday. And so he started pushing Pontiac into motorsports. He hired engineers who actually cared about performance. He greenlit projects that would have made his predecessors faint. And by 1959, Pontiac had developed something called the Superduty program. The name sounds almost innocent, doesn't it? Superduty. Like heavy duty, but more so. But what it actually meant was this: Pontiac was going to build the most powerful engines they possibly could, racing regulations be damned, and see what happened. The first Super Duty engines were based on Pontiac's 389 cubic inch V8. Now, the production 389 was already a decent motor, around 300 horsepower in its hottest factory tune. But the Super Duty version? The engineers bored it out, strengthened everything, added special heads with massive ports, installed a wild camshaft, and bolted on multiple carburetors. The result was somewhere north of 360 horsepower in 1959, from an engine you could technically buy from a dealer. And the dominance began almost immediately. Pontiac Super Duty cars started winning. Stock car races, drag races, it didn't matter. The combination of big power and relatively light weight. Pontiac had also started trimming unnecessary mass from their cars, created something genuinely competitive. By 1960, Pontiac was no longer the brand your dentist drove. Pontiac was the brand that won races. But Knudsen and his engineers weren't satisfied. The 389 was good, but they wanted more. And in 1961 they got it. Pontiac increased the displacement to 421 cubic inches, and the Super Duty treatment continued. This is where the legend really begins. The 421 Super Duty was not a normal engine. I want you to understand that. It shared almost nothing with the production 421 that regular customers could buy. The block was reinforced. The crankshaft was forged steel. The connecting rods were heavy-duty units designed to handle stresses that would destroy standard components. The pistons were forged aluminum. The cylinder heads featured ports so large that they made the already big standard heads look restrictive. And the camshaft? The camshaft was so aggressive that the engine barely idled. It wanted to rev. It wanted to scream. With dual 4-barrel carburetors, the 421 Super Duty was officially rated at 405 horsepower. But here's the part that mattered. That number was a lie, and everyone knew it. See, General Motors had an unofficial agreement with the other American automakers. Nobody would advertise more than 1 horsepower per cubic inch. A 421 cubic inch engine could claim at most 421 horsepower. It was a gentleman's agreement designed to keep the horsepower wars from getting completely out of control. But the actual output of the 421 Superduty, conservative estimates put it around 460 to 500 horsepower. Some people who've dyno-tested surviving engines claim even higher numbers. Think about that for a second. In 1962, when the average family sedan made maybe 150 horsepower, Pontiac was selling an engine that produced 3 times that much, and they were deliberately lying about it to avoid attention. The 421 Superduty dominated everything it entered. In drag racing, Pontiac Catalinas with the Superduty engine were running quarter-mile times that seemed impossible for full-size cars. They were beating purpose-built race cars. They were beating Corvettes. They were beating everything. And in NASCAR, the story was the same. The 1962 Daytona 500 saw Pontiac Superduty cars absolutely crush the competition. Fireball Roberts won the pole position with a speed of over 156 miles per hour, a new record. The Superduty Pontiacs were so fast that the other manufacturers started complaining, loudly. I mention this because the complaints mattered. They mattered a lot. Here's the deal. General Motors was the largest automaker in the world, by far. And with that size came scrutiny. The federal government was already making noise about antitrust concerns. GM's executives were paranoid about anything that might attract regulatory attention. And a racing program that was utterly destroying the competition, that attracted attention. But the pressure wasn't just external. Inside GM, there was a faction that genuinely believed racing was bad for the company's image. These weren't performance enthusiasts. These were corporate executives who saw racing as dangerous, as irresponsible, as something that encouraged reckless behavior on public roads. And they had the ear of the people at the very top. In January 1963, General Motors announced a new corporate policy. They called it the racing ban, though that's a bit of an oversimplification. What GM actually said was that they would no longer participate in or provide support for any form of automotive competition. No factory racing teams, no high-performance parts sold specifically for racing, no Superduty program. Just like that, it was over. Now, I want to be clear about what this meant in practice. Pontiac wasn't just told to stop racing. They were told to destroy everything. The remaining Superduty engines that had been painstakingly developed that represented the cutting edge of American performance technology, were supposed to be scrapped. The tooling was supposed to be discarded. The engineers who had built these incredible machines were told to forget everything they'd learned and go back to designing boring, sensible engines for boring, sensible cars. Bunkie Knudsen, the man who had transformed Pontiac from a dying brand into a performance powerhouse, had already left by this point. He'd been promoted to run Chevrolet in 1961, but his successor, Pete Estes, was just as committed to performance. And both men were furious about the ban. They had built something special, and now they were being told to pretend it never existed. The thing is, the ban was never really about safety or corporate responsibility. It was about politics. It was about powerful people within GM who didn't understand performance and didn't want to understand it. It was about fear of government regulation. And honestly, it was about jealousy. The other divisions within GM, Chevrolet, Oldsmobile, Buick, had their own performance programs, and they didn't like being shown up by Pontiac. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, here's where it gets really interesting. Because the 421 Superduty didn't completely disappear. Not quite. Pontiac had already built a number of Superduty engines before the ban took effect, And while the official policy was to destroy them, that's not exactly what happened. Some engines were sold out the back door to racers who knew the right people. Some were lost in the inventory system, and some, a precious few, ended up in the hands of private collectors who recognized what they had. The exact number of 421 Super Duty engines that survived is disputed. Some historians put it at less than 100, others claim more. What's certain is that they became some of the most valuable and sought-after engines in American automotive history. Today, a documented 421 Super Duty can sell for 6 figures. The complete cars, especially the lightweight Catalinas that were built specifically for drag racing, are worth even more. But here's what really kills me about this story. The ban didn't actually stop GM from racing. Not really. What it stopped was official, above-board factory support. What it created was a shadow world of back-channel deals and plausible deniability. Chevrolet, for example, continued to develop high-performance parts throughout the 1960s. They just didn't sell them directly. Instead, the parts would end up with independent racing teams who happened to have very close relationships with certain Chevrolet engineers. The same thing happened at Pontiac, though to a lesser extent. The engineers who had built the Super Duty engines didn't suddenly forget how to make power. They just had to be more creative about it. And the irony? The racing ban probably hurt GM more than it helped. Ford and Chrysler, who weren't subject to the same internal politics, continued their factory racing programs throughout the 1960s. Ford dominated NASCAR. Chrysler dominated drag racing. And GM, the company that had been winning everything, was suddenly playing catch-up. The engineers at Pontiac did what they could. The GTO, which launched in 1964, was essentially an end run around the corporate brass. It took a mid-sized car and stuffed a big engine in it. Not quite a Super Duty, but still plenty powerful. The executives hadn't banned performance entirely, they'd just banned racing support. So Pontiac created a street car that happened to be insanely fast, marketed it to young buyers, and accidentally invented the muscle car era. But the 421 Super Duty itself, that was gone. The engineers who had built it moved on to other projects. The racing teams that had dominated with it had to find other equipment, and the engine that had terrified GM's own executives faded into legend. I should tell you about what these cars actually felt like to drive, because the numbers don't quite capture it. The 421 Super Duty Catalinas were brutal machines. The engine made peak power high in the rev range, which meant you had to really wind it out to feel what it could do. At low speeds, it was actually somewhat docile. The aggressive camshaft meant it didn't have much bottom-end torque. But once you got past about 4,000 RPM, the thing came alive. The power delivery was savage. There was no gradual buildup, no gentle push. It hit you all at once like someone had opened a gate. The chassis couldn't really handle it. I mean, this was early 1960s suspension technology, leaf springs, drum brakes, recirculating ball steering. The car would squat under acceleration, the rear tires would howl for traction, and the steering would go light as the front wheels tried to leave the ground. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The drag racing versions were even more extreme. Pontiac built a limited run of what they called Swiss cheese Catalinas, cars where the factory had drilled holes in the frame rails, used aluminum body panels, and deleted anything that added unnecessary weight. These things weighed several hundred pounds less than a standard Catalina, and they were fitted with the most powerful versions of the Super Duty engine. On the drag strip, they were capable of elapsed times in the low 12-second range at over 110 miles per hour in 1962. That's genuinely incredible. The NASCAR versions were different but equally impressive. For stock car racing, the focus was on sustained high-speed performance rather than explosive acceleration. The Super Duty engines in these cars were tuned for reliability at full throttle for hours at a time. The cooling systems were upgraded, the oiling systems were enhanced, and the engines were built to withstand the brutal punishment of superspeedway racing. Subscribe if you want more, and let me know in the comments, have you ever owned one of these or know someone who did? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.